Hello and welcome to another of the world's 100 greatest books, brought to you by IntelliQuest. In the next few minutes, you'll learn about Jonathan Swift's Gulliver's Travels and the times in which it was written. And you'll learn that even though the colorful stories it contains have been used to entertain children for centuries, such entertainment value was not what Jonathan Swift, the leading satirist of his time, had in mind. For much of his 78 years, Swift was a political adversary of England's Whig party. Born to a poor family in Ireland in 1667, and a resident of Ireland for much of his life, Swift fought for the rights of the Irish, who at the time were treated by the English as an inferior, subservient colony. Swift's early years were unremarkable. Although brilliant, he did not adapt to academic pursuits readily. He was granted a Bachelor of Arts degree from Trinity College in Dublin, Ireland, as a special favor, even though he'd not satisfactorily met the standards for graduation. He became familiar with English and Irish political life while working for Sir William Temple, a famous nobleman of the time. Then, as many poor young men did at the time, he began a career with the Church of England. Then politics and religion were virtually one and the same. From the beginning, Swift displayed exceptional writing skills, and after some early writing successes, he was hired by the Whig Party to produce material sympathetic to their cause. In 1708, Swift was sent to England to negotiate a more favorable tax structure for the Church. Soon it became clear to him that the Whigs did not share his views, nor those of his employer, the Church. At that time, the country was also getting fed up with Whig policies, and by 1710 it was apparent that the Tories were going to take power. One of the Tory leaders, Robert Harley, began trying to persuade Swift to use his writing skills to further the Tory cause. Harley was sympathetic to a favorable tax structure for the Church, and when Swift saw that the Whigs were about to lose power, he joined with Harley as an advisor and producer of pro-Tory propaganda. The years from 1710 to 1715 were the happiest of Swift's life. He was a powerful, influential figure in the Tory government and became deeply committed to the principles of the Tory party, principles that he would support for the rest of his days. But when Queen Anne died and the Tories fell from power in 1715, it marked the end of Swift's life in England. He returned to Ireland, where he became one of the first great Irish patriots, working to save Ireland from economic exploitation and social deprivation that came from the Whig Party's less-than attitude toward Ireland. Swift wrote many influential works, calling attention to the miserable plight of the Irish under English rule. He helped defeat a coinage proposal that might have destroyed the Irish economy. And in 1729, at the age of 63, Swift wrote a proposal, which he made people think came from a respectable Whig merchant, that suggested that the Irish should fatten their children so they could be used as food on the tables of English noblemen. This helped rally the Irish opposition against English policies. Swift abhorred bloodshed and violence, which had been the theme of the previous century. But while others thought man could find peace and prosperity through his natural goodness and reason, Swift did not. He viewed man as weak and selfish, a creature without the ability to make himself a good life. He felt that for a person to keep his weaknesses from destroying him, he needed the help of religion in the form of an established church. In fact, he opposed the Whigs mainly because they opposed the established church, and he considered the Whigs' belief in man's ability to improve himself through reason alone to be dangerous. Although Swift was a prolific writer, he did not write to earn a living. In fact, because of the explosively political nature of his satirical writings, most of them had to be published anonymously. His technique was to create fictional speakers and get his point across through them. Swift attacked religious dogmatism and fanaticism in A Tale of the Tub. In The Battle of the Books, he attacked what he calls vain learning. And in the Argument Against Banning Christianity, he uses his satirical wit to explain how a true Christian should behave, and why most men weren't coming close to living Christian lives. These are just a few of his many and varied works. At 60 years of age, when he wrote Gulliver's Travels, Swift was not concerned with fame or fortune. He used the book to attack man's ability to reason, the natural goodness of man, and a society based on finance and technology. First published as Travels into Several Remote Nations of the World, Gulliver's Travels features the stories of one Lemuel Gulliver, a naive but likable adventurer who takes 4 fictitious voyages. His first voyage is to the land of the tiny, Lilliput. Then he goes to Brobdingnag, home of the giants, then to Laputa, land of sorcerers and scientists, and finally to Honinumland, a country ruled by horses who dominate a race of human-like beings called Yahoos, a yes-than-flattering term used to put down certain people even today. Gulliver's Travels actually begins with an introductory letter from Captain Gulliver to his cousin Simpson. Its purpose is to establish Gulliver, rather than Swift, as the true author of the book, and to prepare the reader for the journey ahead by telling the impact Gulliver's Travels had on him. Book 1 begins with Gulliver being forced to leave college at Cambridge because of a lack of funds. Since his ambition is to become a surgeon and establish a practice in London, Gulliver apprentices for 4 years with Mr. James Bates, then continues his studies in Europe for 2 years. Returning to England, Gulliver lands a job as a ship's surgeon and makes a number of voyages. But when he tries to set up his practice, a lack of funds forces him to return to sea. On May 4th, 1699, Gulliver becomes the ship's surgeon on a ship named the Antelope. But en route to the East Indies, a violent storm drives the ship into a rock, splitting and sinking it. Gulliver and 6 of the crew manage to get clear of the vessel in a small boat, which in turn is swamped by the waves. "What became of my companions I never knew," Gulliver says, "but I myself swam for shore, and being profoundly exhausted, slept above 9 hours on some soft and very short grass." When Gulliver awakes, he finds to his surprise that he cannot move. Swift writes, "I found my arms and legs were strongly fastened on each side to the ground, and my hair, which was long and thick, tied down in the same manner. I likewise felt several slender ligatures across my body, from my armpits to my thighs. I could only look upwards. The sun began to grow hot, and the light offended my eyes." Suddenly Gulliver is aware of a strange noise, and moments later he feels something moving up his bare leg. Slowly, whatever it is walking across his chest and up to his chin. "Bending my eyes downward as much as I could," Gulliver says, "I perceived to see a human creature not 6 inches high, with a bow and arrow in his hand and a quiver in his back. 40 more of these tiny beings followed the first. Gulliver was so surprised that he yelled at the top of his voice, causing his visitors to run back in fright. Some of them," Gulliver says, "as I learned later, were hurt in falls they got by leaping from my sides upon the ground." However, most of the little men soon returned to study Gulliver. Gulliver, of course, struggled to get loose, but succeeded only in wrenching his left arm and loosening his hair a little. When he struggled, he immediately felt the sharp sting of 100 tiny arrows in his left arm and face. At that point, he decided the smartest thing he could do was to lie still. The next sound Gulliver hears is a pounding. The little people are building a tower, from which their leader can make a speech. Of course, Gulliver couldn't understand a word, but through sign language, he's able to make the leader understand that he will be submissive and that he needs food, knowing all the time that he could overpower their largest armies when he was free. The little people untie one of Gulliver's arms, and the Hergo, which Gulliver learns later is the term for the great lord, commands that ladders be applied to Gulliver's sides. Hundreds of the inhabitants mount these ladders, carrying baskets of meat. There were shoulders, legs, and loins, shaped like mutton, but smaller than the wings of a lark. Gulliver eats 2 to 3 baskets of meat and 3 loaves of bread at a time. "They supplied me as they could, showing 1,000 marks of wonder and astonishment at my bulk and appetite," Gulliver says. For drink, the little people bring up one of their largest hogsheads, which held less than half a pint. In it was a drink that tastes much like Burgundy wine, but sweeter. Gulliver drinks 2 such containers of wine and asks for more, but there is no more. Once he's eaten, the little people marvel at his appetite, shout with joy, and dance on his chest. Gulliver was tempted to do away with 40 or 50 of them, but felt bound by the laws of hospitality. After all, they had fed him at great cost, and Gulliver admired their bravery. They were running all over his chest, while one of his arms was free. Refusing to release Gulliver, they put him on a kind of wagon, described as being 7 feet long, 3 inches from the ground, and riding on 22 wheels. 1,500 of the emperor's largest horses, each about 4.5 inches high, are employed to pull Gulliver to the city, approximately half a mile away. Near the city gates is an abandoned temple about the size of a large doghouse, where it is determined Gulliver should live. 90 chains held together by 36 padlocks are put in place. Then the strings that had bound Gulliver are cut. At this point, Gulliver is introduced to the emperor, who Gulliver describes as a very handsome, strong, and masculine person, plainly and simply clad. Although he can't understand a word, Gulliver later learns that the emperor ordered that he be treated well. The inhabitants cease walking over him, and scholars begin to teach him their language. Clothes and bedding are made for him by sewing together hundreds of the largest rolls of cloth. Gulliver learns the language and finds out that he is in the country of Lilliput. He soon earns the Lilliputians' trust and is given his freedom. A government official named Redressal briefs Gulliver on the country's political situation. It seems Lilliput is divided both politically and religiously into two sides called the High Heels and the Low Heels. These correspond to two religious factions, the Big Endians and the Little Endians. The difference between the two religions is whether one breaks his eggs on the large or small end. Since the present emperor's grandfather ordered that all true believers break their eggs on the small end, the two groups have been enemies. Presently, the Big Endians are in exile in Blefuscu and are planning to invade Lilliput with the help of the Blefuscudian emperor. Gulliver is asked to help the Lilliputians repulse the attack by seizing the Blefuscudian fleet. He swims into the sea between the two countries and attaches cables the size of threads to the enemy ships. Then I took up the knotted end of the cables, Gulliver says, and with great ease took 50 of the enemy's largest men of war after me. The Blefuscudians, who had not the least imagination of what I intended, were at first confounded with astonishment. They had seen me cut the cables to their anchors and thought my design was only to let the ships run adrift or fall afoul on each other. But when they perceived the whole fleet moving in order and saw me pulling at the end, they set up such a scream of grief and despair that it is almost impossible to describe or conceive. Despite being hit by a number of arrows fired by Blefuscudian sailors, Gulliver is able to draw about half the fleet away with him to Lilliput. The Lilliputian emperor is not satisfied. He asks Gulliver to capture the rest of the navy, thus reducing the empire to a province. But Gulliver refuses, saying, "I would never be an instrument of bringing a free and brave people into slavery." After debate with the Lilliputian council, Gulliver's point of view is accepted. The emperor, however, doesn't forgive Gulliver, and soon Gulliver hears of a plot to put out his eyes and slowly starve him to death. Since a peace had been made with Blefuscu, and the Blefuscudians appreciate Gulliver's decision not to capture their entire fleet, Gulliver decides to escape to Blefuscu. After a few days, Lilliput's emperor sends a message requesting Gulliver's return as a traitor, bound hand and foot. But the Blefuscudian emperor refuses, giving Gulliver asylum. Soon thereafter, Gulliver discovers a boat that had washed onto the shore that was capable of taking him to sea. He completes repairs on the boat, stocks it with provisions, and goes to sea. He's eventually picked up by an English merchant ship, which carries him safely to England. After 10 restless months in England, Gulliver begins his second journey aboard the ship Adventure. During the voyage, the ship anchors off an unknown island in search of water. Gulliver goes ashore to do some exploring on his own. Suddenly, he sees his shipmates run for the boats and row for their lives toward the ship. Behind them comes a huge creature some 60 feet tall, who quits chasing them when his feet strike sharp rocks in the shallow water. Gulliver runs the opposite direction as fast as he can. After hiding for a time, he finds himself in a large country full of very high grass and begins to explore it. About an hour later, Gulliver comes across a family of giants who are harvesting barley. Seeing their enormous size, Gulliver feels despair. He remembers Lilliput, where his superior size made him a dominant force, and where stories of him would live forever, and he feels as a single Lilliputian would amongst us. As the giants begin to mow the hay, Gulliver fears being trampled or cut to death, so he yells as loudly as he can. One of the men hears him and picks him up. Gulliver expects to be squashed, much as he might squash a vile insect, but instead the giant is curious. He is intrigued by Gulliver's speech and gestures, even though he couldn't understand them, and puts Gulliver in a shirt pocket for safekeeping. Later, Gulliver is turned over to his finder's master, who puts Gulliver in the care of his 9-year-old daughter named Glumdalclitch. She was very good-natured and not above 40 feet high, being little for her age. Glumdalclitch renames Gulliver Grildig and treats him with great care and affection like a loving pet. She makes him a cradle and hangs it in the air to guard against mice, which were Gulliver's size. In fact, he'd already had to kill one mouse with his sword when it threatened his life. Gulliver also had a confrontation with a frog, who nearly capsized the boat that had been made for him, and with a monkey the size of an elephant, who mistakenly thinks Gulliver was one of its young and begins trying to force vile food down its throat. Soon Gulliver's master, the farmer, realizes that Gulliver can make him money as a sideshow. Gulliver has to make so many appearances that he's feeling as if he will die, when the Queen, who sees him perform, buys him. At Gulliver's request, the Queen allowed Glumdalclitch to remain with him. Gulliver, who has mastered the language, enjoys his stay with the royal family. He has many talks with the king, a wise and good man who asks for information on the government and history of England, which Gulliver tells him was the greatest in Europe. In answering the king's questions, however, Gulliver exposes the flaws in the English system as Jonathan Swift sees them. He says that spots in the House of Lords can be bought, that cash can help one get elected to the House of Commons, that courts favor the rich over the poor, that lawyers take cases that benefit them rather than their clients, and that bishops tend to be appointed for political reasons rather than for their knowledge of religion or their moral conscience. The king is appalled by what Gulliver has told him. "My little friend Grildig," he says, "you have made a most admirable explanation upon your country. You have clearly proved that ignorance, idleness, and vice are the proper ingredients for qualifying a legislator, that laws are best explained, interpreted, and applied by those whose interest and abilities lie in perverting, confounding, and eluding them. By what I have gathered from your own relation, and the answers I have with much pains wringed and extorted from you, I cannot but conclude the bulk of your natives to be the most pernicious race of little odious vermin that nature ever suffered to crawl upon the surface of the earth." Swift has used the king's voice to express his feelings about those ruling English society. When Gulliver is asked by the king's engineers to show them how to make a cannon which could batter down the strongest walls or destroy a whole metropolis, the king is struck with horror. He asks how so impotent and groveling an insect as I could entertain such inhuman ideals. The king tells Gulliver if he values his life, he will not mention the cannon to anyone again. In Brobdingnagian society, those who produce were rewarded and praised, not those who governed. And the knowledge they had was used for practical purposes. They did not deal in abstract theories. Gulliver escapes Brobdingnag by accident. One day he is taken to the beach by a young boy who is a friend of Glumdalclitch. The boy forgets about Gulliver and leaves the box in which he is kept unguarded. An eagle picks up the box and flies off with it. Fortunately for Gulliver, 2 other birds chase the eagle, and he drops the box into the ocean. In an hour's time, Gulliver is rescued by a British ship. Gulliver is fatigued, and his stories of 60-foot-tall giants make him appear to be a madman. Nobody believes him until Gulliver shows the captain the tooth of one of the Brobdingnagians, which is 12 inches long. After an uneventful voyage, Gulliver reaches England on June 3, 1706. He's been gone for 4 years, 2 years among the giants. A mere 10 days after Gulliver is back in England, he accepts another offer to go to sea and sets sail on the ship Hopewell. Upon reaching Indochina, the captain of the Hopewell decides that it is necessary for the ship to lie at anchor for a few months. To cover some of the cost, Gulliver is put in charge of a sloop and sent on a trading mission. At first, the mission is successful, but then Gulliver's ship is attacked by 2 pirates. One of the pirates, a Dutchman, wants to do away with Gulliver and his crew, but the other, a Japanese, prevents it. Gulliver is set adrift with 2 days' provisions, while his crew remains captive. Gulliver reaches a small clump of islands, which he explores. On the 4th day, the air suddenly becomes cooler and the sky darker. When he looks up, Gulliver sees an enormous floating island covered with people. Soon he is lifted to the island, where he discovers the strangest people he's ever seen. They are dressed in long robes that feature illustrations of the moon, sun, stars, and planets. They are absent-minded and can't carry on conversations without the help of special servants called flappers. These people strike the ear of the master when it's his turn to listen. Without flappers, the inhabitants of the flying land of Laputa wouldn't remember to speak or listen. It turns out that Laputa is the home of a race of mathematicians, astronomers, and musicians. They are so removed from life that their wives try to escape from them and are constantly unfaithful. Laputa, however, holds a strange power over Balnibarbi, the continent below. Gulliver asks for and receives permission to visit Balnibarbi. He is let down near Legado, Balnibarbi's largest city, and finds chaos. The people live in poverty. The buildings are falling down. In the countryside, fertile land is not being used to grow crops. The only place Gulliver can find order and productivity is on the estate of Count Monodi. Gulliver learns from Count Monodi that agriculture, architecture, learning, and politics are directed by a group called the Projectors, who are under the influence of the abstract learning practices of the flying island of Laputa. The country is in ruins because nothing ever gets done. When Gulliver visits the Academy of Projectors, he finds that they're devoting their lives to nonsense, such as attempting to extract sunbeams from cucumbers, trying to convert human waste back into the food from which it came, and developing a breed of naked sheep. He considers the Academy a madhouse. It's obvious that he's described his view of the English government, its works, and the plight of its subjects. From Balnibarbi, Gulliver visits the islands of Glubbdubdrib and Lugnag. On Glubbdubdrib, Gulliver meets a magician who can summon spirits from the past. He speaks with ghosts from the classical past and modern Europe, is struck by the inferiority of the modern world, and appalled by the amount of cruelty and crime in human history. On Lugnag, Gulliver hears of a race of immortals called Struldbrugs. At first he thinks how lucky they must be, but when he meets them, he discovers that while they live forever, they continue to age. Explains Gulliver, they had not only the follies and infirmities of other old men, but many more which arose from the dreadful prospect of never dying. They were not only opinionative, peevish, covetous, morose, vain, talkative, but incapable of friendship and dead to all natural affection. Envy and impotent desires are their prevailing passions, and if a Struldbrug should happen to marry one of his own kind, the marriage was dissolved, of course, by the courtesy of the kingdom as soon as the younger of the two comes to be fourscore, for the law thinks it reasonable indulgence that those who are condemned without any fault of their own to a perpetual continuance in the world should not have their misery doubled by the load of a wife. Gulliver decides that eternal life is nothing without eternal youth. After a visit to Japan, Gulliver returns home after an absence of 5 years and 6 months. After spending a few months at home, Gulliver goes to sea again, this time as the captain of the ship Adventure. Sickness among the crew forces the ship to put in at Barbados in order to recruit more men. But those who are taken on are pirates and criminals, and soon afterward they mutiny. At first Gulliver is locked in his cabin. Then he is put ashore on what is believed to be an uninhabited island. As Gulliver explores the island, he notices some hairy, human-like brutes, which he describes this way. Their heads and breasts were covered with thick hair, some frizzled and others lank. They had beards like goats, and a long ridge of hair down their backs, and the foreparts of their legs and feet. But the rest of their bodies were bare, so that I might see their skins, which were a brown buff color. They had no tails nor any hair at all on their buttocks. I never beheld in any of my travels so disagreeable an animal, or one against which I naturally conceived so strong an antipathy. It wasn't long until one of the beasts blocked Gulliver's path. In an attempt to pass by, he strikes it with the blunt edge of his sword, causing it to let out a blood-chilling howl. Almost immediately, Gulliver is surrounded by a pack of these beasts. He backs up against a tree, brandishing his sword. Several of the cursed brood, Gulliver notes,
getting hold of the branches behind, leaped up into the trees, from whence they began to discharge their excrements on my head. However, I escaped pretty well by sticking close to the stem of the tree, but was almost stifled with the filth which fell about me on every side. All of a sudden the brutes scatter, and Gulliver doesn't know why. All he sees is approaching horses, who seem to be carrying on a conversation. Later, Gulliver is led by one of the horses to the horses' home. There he learns that the horses, called Houyhnhnms, are the masters of the land, and the human-like beasts, called Yahoos, are subservient to them. To Gulliver, the Yahoos are disgusting, and he tries to separate himself from them, choosing to live with the Houyhnhnms, who live a life of pure reason, without hate, unhealthy ambition, passion, or disease. He has decided that he wants no more to do with the human race. After many discussions with the Grey Horse, Gulliver decides to live out his life with them. He wears clothes made from Yahoo skins, eats the same diet as the Houyhnhnms, milk and oatcakes, and resigns himself to living as an inferior being. However, the Houyhnhnms fear that Gulliver will corrupt the Yahoos and vote to put him off the island. He builds a boat and departs in 2 months with a heavy heart. Gulliver reaches an island and hides from the savages that inhabit it. But the savages find him and wound him in the knee with an arrow. Later, when Gulliver sees a Portuguese ship, he decides that he'd rather take his chances with the savages who wounded him than to go back to civilization. But the Portuguese find him and insist that he come aboard. On board, Gulliver's behavior is like that of a madman because he is so down on the human race. Finally, the kindly captain convinces Gulliver to return to his wife and family. However, even after being home for 5 years, Gulliver can still not stand to be touched by his wife or any other human. He spends much of his time in the stables talking to horses, whose smell he finds far more pleasant than that of man. And so, Gulliver's Travels ends. It was in this crazed state that Jonathan Swift actually spent his final years. He was totally disillusioned with the English government and had no faith in the goodness of his fellow man. Now, let's quickly review the significance of Gulliver's Travels. In Book 1, Swift's main point is that the quest for unlimited power, as exemplified by the Emperor, creates a government that is corrupt. In Lilliput, advancement is not based on merit, it is based on pleasing the Emperor, who is an absolute monarch. People who are willing to give up their dignity for political advancement are rewarded. In this story, Gulliver is not only bigger, but better. He is kind, patient, and humble, and he believes in justice. He is the symbol of what Swift thinks man should be. In Book 2, everything changes. Gulliver is put in a position of total subservience. He struggles not only to stay alive, but to maintain his dignity as a man. He works hard to convince the giants that he should be taken seriously. In doing so, he becomes pathetic, because nothing he does can impress them. When he tries to impress the king with English life and government, he becomes the spokesman for all he hates, a government that is corrupt and cruel. In trying to show he is as good as the giants, he shows he is prideful, corrupt, and cruel, just as were the Lilliputians. By showing us both sides of Gulliver in these 2 books, Swift questions whether humanity should be held in high esteem, and suggests that there is much more to man than meets the eye. Swift sees pride as man's downfall, because it is pride that causes him to do things that are against what Swift seems to believe is his better judgment. The third work is an attack against science as it was then. Swift believed that finding out what causes natural phenomena was not significant. He believed that knowledge gained through science had no connection to the moral quality of a person's life. On the floating planet, he shows that the scientists are totally cut off from real life. Their knowledge does not assure that they can carry on any of the normal functions of life. Swift considered science insignificant because he believed it depends totally on the human intellect. He pictured the projectors in Book 3 failing miserably because their projects make no common sense. By showing us Count Menottes' well-run estate, Swift attempts to show stark contrast between the abstract, visionary thinking of the scientists of the day and Menottes' approach of implementing what had been learned in the past. He repeatedly points out that man's intellect alone is not enough to solve the problems of the present.
In the final journey, Swift attempts to identify the true nature of man. On one hand, he has the Yahoos, who are described as odious, filthy, greedy, tormented brutes without reason. And on the other hand, he has the Pseudonyms, the remarkable creatures with the power of absolute reason. Gulliver is caught between. He fears that man can degenerate to the standards of the Yahoos, and yet can't live up to the Hun standards. When man makes bad use of his reasoning powers, he appears to become worse than the Yahoos. Throughout the book, Swift points out that man is neither inherently good or bad. But to be good, he must recognize his limitations and accept help from sources like religion that can give it. In summary, Swift wrote Gulliver's Travels because he felt that the moral standards he believed in were eroding.
This is the end of the session.
Food on the tables of English noblemen. This helped rally the Irish opposition against English policies. Swift abhorred bloodshed and violence, which had been the theme of the previous century. But while others thought man could find peace and prosperity through his natural goodness and reason, Swift did not. He viewed man as weak and selfish, a creature without the ability to make himself a good life. He felt that for a person to keep his weaknesses from destroying him, he needed the help of religion in the form of an established church. In fact, he opposed the Whigs mainly because they opposed the established church, and he considered the Whigs' belief in man's ability to improve himself through reason alone to be dangerous. Although Swift was a prolific writer, he did not write to earn a living. In fact, because of the explosively political nature of his satirical writings, most of them had to be published anonymously. His technique was to create fictional speakers and get his point across through them. Swift attacked religious dogmatism and Temple, a famous nobleman of the time. Then, as many poor young men did at the time, he began a career with the Church of England. Then politics and religion were virtually one and the same. From the beginning, Swift displayed exceptional writing skills, and after some early writing successes, he was hired by the Whig Party to produce material sympathetic to their cause. In 1708, Swift was sent to England to negotiate a more favorable tax structure for the church. Soon it became clear to him that the Whigs did not share his views, nor those of his employer, the church. At that time, the country was also getting fed up with Whig policies, and by 1710 it was apparent that the Tories were going to take power. One of the Tory leaders, Robert Harley, began trying to persuade Swift to use his writing skills to further the Tory cause. Harley was sympathetic to a favorable tax structure for the church, and when Swift saw that the Whigs were about to lose power, he joined with Harley as an advisor and producer of pro-Tory propaganda. The years from 1710 to 1715 were the happiest of Swift's life. He was a powerful, influential figure in the Tory government and became deeply committed to the principles of the Tory party, principles that he would support for the rest of his days. But when Queen Anne died and the Tories fell from power in 1715, it marked the end of Swift's life in England. He returned to Ireland, where he became one of the first great Irish patriots, working to save Ireland from economic exploitation and social deprivation that came from the Whig Party's less-than attitude toward Ireland. Swift wrote many influential works, calling attention to the miserable plight of the Irish under English rule. He helped defeat a coinage proposal that might have destroyed the Irish economy. And in 1729, at the age of 63, Swift wrote a proposal, which he made people think came from a respectable Whig merchant, that suggested that the Irish should fatten their children so they could be used as fanaticism in A Tale of the Tub. In The Battle of the Books, he attacked what he calls vain learning. And in the Argument Against Banning Christianity, he uses his satirical wit to explain how a true Christian should behave, and why most men weren't coming close to living Christian lives. These are just a few of his many and varied works. At 60 years of age, when he wrote Gulliver's Travels, Swift was not concerned with fame or fortune. He used the book to attack man's ability to reason, the natural goodness of man, and a society based on finance and technology. First published as Travels into Several Remote Nations of the World, Gulliver's Travels features the stories of one Lemuel Gulliver, a naive but likable adventurer who takes 4 fictitious voyages. His first voyage is to the land of the tiny, Lilliput, Then he goes to Brobdingnag, home of the giants, then to Laputa, land of sorcerers and scientists. Hello and welcome to another of the world's 100 greatest books, brought to you by IntelliQuest. In the next few minutes, you'll learn about Jonathan Swift's Gullivers Travels and the times in which it was written. And you'll learn that even though the colorful stories it contains have been used to entertain children for centuries, such entertainment value is not what Jonathan Swift, the leading satirist of his time, had in mind. For much of his 78 years, Swift was a political adversary of England's Whig party. Born to a poor family in Ireland in 1667, and a resident of Ireland for much of his life, Swift fought for the rights of the Irish, who at the time were treated by the English as an inferior, subservient colony. Swift's early years were unremarkable. Although brilliant, he did not adapt to academic pursuits readily. He was granted a Bachelor of Arts degree from Trinity College in Dublin, Ireland, as a special favor, even though he'd not satisfactorily met the standards for graduation. He became familiar with English and Irish political life while working for Sir William